It's a great pleasure to be here. So question is, why am I thinking about density? Then obviously the context of the conference is urban green growth within planetary boundaries. And we've just heard from two speakers why actually density is very important, why the city scale is very important. And I think a first step in thinking about a transformation or a theory of change also needs to have within it attention to how we define good density. And actually, I'm going to be talking today about both good and bad and some of the fuzzy areas in between, how we decide which is which and how the two are interrelated. So the presentation then, I'm going to be, first of all, it's going to be in 4 parts. First of all, thinking about some general background context. Then secondly, moving on to the definition of good density, which is something that we did in a recent project, which was funded by the Urban Land Institute, who are very interested in how the real estate industry can support more sustainable development, and something called the Coalition for Urban Transitions, which is part of a large global commission on new climate economy. Next, density returns, some results. One of the things that they wanted us to do in our work, which was an 18 months project in the end, was to look at how real estate investment returns related to various aspects of good density. And finally, coming on to think about, from the conclusions from that research, how actually we can invest in good density. So here we've got some bold statistics. So you're obviously familiar with the first one about GDP and the amount of GDP, 80%, which is now generated by cities. And we can see there some statistics on the global energy that's consumed also by cities and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. To those, we must add other kinds of resource consumption and other kinds of pollution, like particulates and nitrous oxide and so on. So there's more to it than just greenhouse gases, and we did take that on board in our research. But I think a key thing to think about with this is that cities have always been places that attracted population who were interested in innovation, enterprise, and business. So people that work in cities, live in cities, the innovation and enterprise associated with them has always been something that's historically been associated with cities, and particularly large cities. But of course, what's happening today with a changing world economy and a change to added value that's coming from a more knowledge-intensive part of the economy is that it's been very difficult for global population to be supported and their livelihood supported simply by working on the land or working in manufacturing production. So there's been an urban to rural to urban shift, which has been very pronounced. And just as an example, China, its urbanization has trebled in the last 3 decades, and that sort of profile is set to continue, with massive amounts of new real estate being constructed, and at the same time, their economy has changed dramatically, which is what I'm going to come on to in a moment. But so clearly a lot of important international comments on the fact that, you know, sustainable development now must be achieved within and through cities. And the I think the second quote from UN Habitat is particularly relevant, thinking about the fact that we need a new kind of city. So this very much relates to what Martin was talking about earlier. It needs to be a good, people-centered city. It needs to be one that's capable of integrating tangible and more intangible aspects of prosperity. Again, that relates to what Martin was saying about the divide that we currently face. Shedding off inefficient and unsustainable forms and functions. But so a key question that arises from this commentary is what new kind of city, what new kind of urban forms, what new kind of urban functions? So moving on, I hope you can read this okay. I'm one of the directors at the Globalization and World Cities Research Group, which some of you may have heard of, and this operates through Loughborough University in the UK. I'm actually the director for global city planning, and one of the things that we innovated in about 2000 was the collection of data on knowledge-intensive firms. So their financial services and the business services in things like legal, accountancy, management consultancy, who of course also are involved in advanced logistics, IT, etc. So you're looking at a broad range of sectors that are very knowledge intensive. We do a ranking, and here you can see the results that have just been published for 2018. Now, if you think about it, it's not necessarily what you would expect in terms of the number of cities there in the Alpha plus and Alpha, which are in the Asia-Pacific rim. So obviously we think about places like London, New York, and other key European cities, but now we're getting a much higher number of cities that are becoming agglomerations for these kinds of knowledge-intensive business services in the Asia-Pacific rim. And of course that does reflect the massive urbanization that's been happening and advances in the economies in the countries of those places, but particularly the cities, because that's where these kinds of businesses are most focused. You'll also see there that given that Hong Kong is now back part of China again, we've actually got 3 leading global cities in these activities, all within the Chinese state. So we've got Hong Kong, we've got Beijing, we've got Shanghai. That's a massive change, which does reflect the urbanization that's gone on in the last 3 decades, and also the economic changes. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a change, particularly of Beijing and Shanghai, from being in the top 30s 3 decades ago to now being in that top 10 of global cities. Right, moving on to good density and how we define it. So this project, as I said, ran in the end for about 18 months. And the ULI had a concept, a vision, which was that they felt that it was possible that better cities in terms of good density, better climate, would actually have a relationship with the returns on real estate investment. And that's what we were asked to investigate. You can see there some headlines on the findings, which I'm going to go into more detail on the next slides. Obviously, this required a quantitative approach. So some of the softer issues that Martha, for example, has discussed around good density, it wasn't possible to get quantitative data on for this project, and they wanted a global comparative analysis. So we actually managed to find data for some significant good density indicators for 63 cities in the world. But all of those also had to have good real estate returns data. So cities that didn't have that obviously were immediately detached from our study. So it is selective. And that's basically because of the terms of reference, which were about looking to see to what extent good density carbon emissions related to returns on real estate investment. These are the actual investment and fund management companies that were supporting the research and putting funding into it. So as you can see, some very big names there, and you can understand their interest in the topic. What densities matter? We were following on from a previous study by the Urban Land Institute, which was basically a desk study looking at a range of grey literature on what kinds of things might be outcomes of good density and also outcomes of bad density. And as you can see, this is a very soft approach. So we did a multidisciplinary literature review to find out from academic scholarly literature what some of the issues might be behind these associations in the previous study. from that, we identified the following good density characteristics, which we then tried to collect data on. So as you can see, we've got regional clustering. That's looking at the distribution of land uses across space, not just within a metropolitan area, but in a wider city region area. And we found this to be very important in terms of good density, especially in terms of commuting flows and carbon emissions that are transferred across a region and end up in the most dense places. So housing markets and their relationship to office markets are obviously important in understanding that. Secondly, physical density. With that, we were looking at built-up density, and we were also looking at urban extent density, in other words, compactness, and also in that comes open space. Employment and economic structure. We were particularly looking for those knowledge-intensive activities that are also employing expertise and skills at that level of added value. In terms of GDP, green and blue, that speaks for itself. We were looking at vegetation, trees, etc., lakes, rivers, and how they're employed within cities. Public transport infrastructure. With that, we were particularly interested in the services that were provided, access to those services, and also to things like multimodal nodal exchanges from one mode to another, because obviously that's very important for the actual usability of public transport infrastructure. Good governance. We were looking at scales of governance across different geographical areas, and also at the issue of different sectors, and also, of course, private-public governance, which are very interwoven. So moving on to what we found, these are just some headlines. What we found was that the strongest correlations, this is from doing a Spearman rank correlation analysis, were that large cities, dense cities, had higher returns on office real estate investment. We also found that cities with higher levels of innovation and a presence of business services, financial services also had a strong association with the returns on investment. We also looked, although this was more difficult, we could only do this for European cities, looking at retail, returns on retail investment. And here we found cities with higher levels of tourism were important for returns, and also higher levels of business services were important for returns. So those were the highlights, but this was a global level analysis, remember. So we were looking across 63 cities. And we then felt that there was a real need to pick out some cities as examples to look and see what was happening more at a landscape level, a granular level within cities. So moving on, one of the reasons for this was it became very apparent from our literature review that, for example, the transportation of emissions across space due to travel, which is very prevalent in polycentric regions where you've got a number of cities and towns in relatively close proximity, was having a devastating impact on pollution levels, greenhouse gas emissions, and potential risk for human health in very dense places. So obviously very important to think about what's going on then at that city level. This is an example of a city analysis. So what we've got here is we've got Hong Kong, which actually had the highest returns on office real estate investment of the 63 cities that we studied. We've got London, which is one of the top global cities, as you will have seen from our rankings, our Globalization and World Cities Research rankings. And we've got Paris. And Paris is in there because it's a reasonably strong city for business and financial services. Again, it was high up on our Gork analysis, but it has a very different profile. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to make these out in terms of the colours. We've got 2 shades of green there. Hong Kong is the darker green, and Paris is blue, London is the lighter green. What we see from this is that the strongest association for Hong Kong with its high return on real estate investment is actually its physical density, its compactness, and its very high built-up density. As you can see there, it's the highest of all of the cities that we looked at, with London and Paris scoring much lower on the built-up density. All of them are reasonably high on business and financial services, although there are some differences with innovation. And actually, if you follow London's paler green line around the outside, you'll see that reflecting its global city status, it ranks very strong on business services, actually real estate capital flows, financial flows and innovation. And yet those real estate returns on investment are slightly lower. So, you know, we need to think about that. What you'll also see, a very important finding from this, is that Hong Kong has got much lower emissions, carbon emissions per person, so that's per head of population, than London and Paris, although it's got high total emissions. Now, the reason for this is that we do know that the higher the density, the more people are crowded into a city, the lower your emissions will be. However, with a very dense city, that doesn't mean that total emissions get less. On the other hand, it means that if you spread that population out, there would be a different effect. Carbon emissions would be higher per head, and this is why London and Paris have higher emissions per head, because they're less dense. So actually what we can learn from this is not that Hong Kong and density are bad in terms of warming. Actually, it's good, but there are going to be other factors that we have to think about. So one of the factors is that if we look at open space, then all of those cities, we need to think about how do we conserve open space. Open space important in terms of the urban realm, people's feelings and happiness and mental health in a city. We also need to think about the space for green and blue environment, and actually building the blue and the green environment into the infrastructure, into the urban realm, and even into and onto the buildings becomes very important. So I'm going to move on from that one now because we're running out of time. This is just to show you the transportation of carbon emissions across space in the case of London. And you can see the hotspots, which I think map onto Martha's points that she raised before, and also show the huge emissions around Heathrow. Now, just bear in mind that a lot of that won't be to do with aircraft. That will be to do with ground traffic. So, thinking about good versus bad density, where and why, these are complicating factors, and they all need to be taken into consideration. Not all of it can be, some of it can be defined quantitatively, but not all of it can be defined quantitatively on the basis of existing evidence. Another aspect which I didn't mention on my spider diagram before of the 3 cities is that tourism was very important for all 3 cities, and we think that is around diversity. We think it's around the fact that diverse cities have more potential for creativity and creative industries. And also, in the case of Paris, it was the most associated with those high returns on real estate investment. So we need to think then about other qualitative aspects which you can't necessarily incorporate in a quantitative model around, as I said before, things like heritage, urban realm, and so on. How to invest in good density? I've only got a minute left, so I'm going to move on a pace here. Encouraging news. Investors were found from our research to care about how their money is being invested. They're very concerned about global warming and about sustainable development. Risk-adjusted returns matter, and increasingly investors, funds are wanting to build this risk of health, of perhaps not prolonged returns on investment due to risk factors as open space shrinks, as pollution goes up. So this is all good, this is positive. It means there's a business case for doing more, and it means that there's a worldwide investor interest. And these are just some comments from the people who funded the research, that basically investor attitudes need to change in terms of how they measure density. We need to really think about the associations between good and bad, the fact that they will be fluid over time, and we need to have more granular data. So just finally, changing private public sector actions is needed. These are the different elements that we need data for, comparative data and also at city level, in order to be able to get better data to understand good and bad density. And finally, we're doing visualization work at Reading University, looking at how we can map, and we've produced a prototype mapping tool where you can sit down and it's interactive, and you can have government officials, you can have investors working together to look at the city or the city region level to see how good and bad density actually map on to the space of the cities at that landscape level. So these are all things going forward. And just to point out that you've got my webpage there, which shows more of my research, and these are the links to the research findings. If you're a member of the ULI, you will need to go to the second link, which is on the Open Access Publications depository to get hold of the reports. So sorry it's been a bit rushed at the end, but obviously we're a bit behind in the programme.
Thanks so much.